Hello everybody, and welcome to our Season of Creation webinar series. This is the first one in the series, and you're very, very welcome. Cate Williams is here. She's going to be talking about Forest Church. We also have sessions coming up about theology, climate change and theology, or theology of climate change, a session about environment and worship, and another session about climate action as mission. So they're all to come. A little bit of housekeeping. You can chat to each other in the chat, but questions will be good in the Q&A. There's already one question. Will the recording be posted somewhere later? Yes, it will. And I'll let you know where, but I don't know the answer to where yet. So I will say that as answered. So as we go along, post your questions in the question and answer. The beauty of that is if someone else has put a question that you really like the look of, you can vote for it. So it rises up the list of questions so that when we come to the questions at the end, we answer the questions that people are most interested in. And if we run out of time, we know that we've hit the priorities. So chat to each other in the chat, but questions in the Q&A. Just to say, my name's Jo Chamberlain, and I'm the National Environment Officer. I work at head office, if you like. And Cate is going to introduce herself, and I'm going to hand straight over to her now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Right, let me get my screen share sorted, and then I'll go from there. So, okay, there we go. So, I'm Cate Williams. I work for Gloucester Diocese as Environmental Engagement Officer. And I've been in this role for, gosh, how many months is it since January? For 8 months or so, since the beginning of January. And before that, I was working for the diocese in a broader outward-facing role, which included pioneering and fresh expressions, amongst other things. So I actually come at Forest Church from two different angles. So the environmental engagements, the way that this engagement with the outdoors, with the natural world, actually supports the environmental conversations and action that are a huge challenge for our society at the moment. And also in terms of fresh expressions, Forest Church is a place where people can engage with the life of the church, who we're probably unlikely to find in our church buildings, but connect with us in questions of the outdoors and the natural world and the environment. I've nearly finished a PhD, hopefully really nearly. It's kind of right at the last stages. That's relevant because I've done some PhD fieldwork around Forest Church, and I will talk about that a little bit later as we go along. I'm an ordained Anglican. I was a vicar for 14 years before moving into my current work with Gloucester Diocese, and I wrote the Forest Church Grove booklet, which again I will refer to as we go along. And quick plug while I'm at it, it's a great starting point if you're just getting into this and exploring it for yourselves. Grove are always a great series for being short and snappy and getting people started. So as I say, the joy of Forest Church is that it has that double access to it. It's a really important way of connecting us to nature, really critical against the background of the environmental crises, climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, and also a fresh expression that engages people who find their spiritual space in nature and the outdoors. So Forest Church is a really important piece of the jigsaw puzzle as we seek to engage with the huge challenges that are in front of us. It helps us to reset our attitude and our relationship with nature. It enables us to do so prayerfully. And then much follows, because as we engage with God's creation prayerfully, as we grow in appreciation and grow in love for the natural world, then action that is positive in terms of the challenges in front of us follow on actually fairly naturally, because it becomes an obvious thing to be doing rather than a difficult thing to be doing. So I'm going to take a step backwards and do a bit of backstory about Forest Church. To the right there is something that I pinched off of the BBC website, Coronavirus, the rules for the places of worship. And that's really just flagging the fact that there's been a huge surge of interest in outdoor worship of various kinds, because we've had to, because it's been safer than worship indoors for the last 18 months, and so that the growth of the Facebook group on Forest Church has been huge, because people have been exploring and looking for things that they can do with their children and families, and outdoor worship has been something that many have found themselves exploring, and that's great. It's been awful, the whole pandemic, but it's great when there's a silver lining or two. But it's not the beginning of the story. There's a surge of interest, but the backstory goes back much further. To the left on your screen is Bruce Stanley's book, Forest Church, which was published in 2013. And Bruce's book expresses the first movement, if I can put it that way. It's an important date for the Forest Church movement that has been growing over the last decade in the UK and internationally as well. So it's new in the sense of this being fresh expressions, exploring outdoors and exploring in environmental and ways, and in ways that are connected to nature. But of course, the backstory is much longer and goes back much further. So this slide, I'm referencing the Franciscan tradition. So the little excerpt there of the Canticle of the Sun, and a bit from the Hillfield Friary website. So outdoor spirituality, engaging with nature as a spiritual practice, isn't something new. It's something that we have rediscovered in recent years, and Forest Church is an expression of that. But it's actually a contemporary version of a very long tradition that prays outside, that finds God in nature, and that has a real depth of connection to the natural world. The Franciscan tradition isn't the only tradition, though it is perhaps the best known and the most famous of that. So the baseline of Forest Church is doing outdoors what you couldn't do indoors. Engagement with nature, and the buzz phrase that tends to be around is nature connection. There are other kinds of outdoor worship, all of which are good. Just any kind of gathering that takes the guitars outside and sings, traditional Palm Sunday processions. There are so many different things that can be done outside, which are great, but they're not Forest Church unless they are explicitly engaging with nature, where nature connection is a part of the spiritual discipline. So the image there just gives a quick example, and that's an occasion where with my Forest Church we were looking at autumn colours, and we made ourselves not exactly a rainbow, because the nature of the colours, it's kind of greens and yellows and browns, but we were looking at all the different variety of colours that we could find, probably in about 3 or 4 weeks' time, several years ago. That sense of looking at what's there and noticing and appreciating, and a kind of something which has us noticing and then taking that noticing into prayer and thanksgiving. That tends to be, well, it is at the heart of Forest Church. I should also say that Forest Church doesn't have to be in a forest. It's really it's a kind of a catch-all phrase for the outdoors. So some forest churches will meet on a beach or moorlands, churchyards, urban green spaces, whatever and wherever. So don't feel that if you don't have a forest near you, you can't do forest church. That's just a kind of a catch-all and a heading, really, that we tend to go by. So why has forest church come to the fore in the last 10 or so years? Why have we got this resurgence of interest in nature connection, in going outdoors as church? And the backdrop to this really is movements within wider society. I put a few things up on the screen there. So environmental charities realised over the last couple of decades that we can't guilt trip people into living right by the planet. That if we feel guilty, what tends to happen is that we put up our barriers and we ignore and we continue with life as normal. And what actually enables those barriers to come down and for us to start engaging and to start living differently is actually connection, noticing, appreciating, and falling in love with the natural world. So there's been a real energy around us in the environmental movement and in the wildlife charities to get us engaging and noticing and appreciating. So a few examples up here: Forest School, which many of you will know about. That's outdoor learning. It sometimes gets called when it's in a standard school setting rather than a forest school as such. The National Trust's 50 Things to Do Before You're 11 3/4, which is all kinds of very ordinary things, many of them. Catch a falling leaf, pick blackberries and eat them, go camping, dam a stream, but just all things that get children muddy and messy and outdoors and engaging and noticing. Wildlife Watch is the children and families branch of the wildlife trusts, and they have loads of resources up there. So flag that whilst I'm here. We use their spotter sheets and various things as part of our Forest Church gatherings, so that there's some really good resources on there under the things to do tab. And also draw your attention to the book Last Child in the Woods by a guy called Richard Louv. And what he's done in this book is draw together a load of research about how being disconnected from nature is actually really bad for us in terms of our mental health and our well-being. And he uses that phrase, nature deficit disorder, and talks about research, for example, that says that if you're in hospital and recovering from an illness and can see green things and trees outside of your hospital window, you will actually recover quicker to a level that is measurable and statistically significant. So there's all kinds of things where getting outside and seeing green things and being in the natural world is really important for our well-being, and we have lost and forgotten and somehow moved away from that. So reconnection, which actually as Christians completely makes sense, that if you know, God has made all that is around us, and here we are as people, as part of God's creation, and we talk about relationships so much, don't we, in the Christian faith, relationships with God and with one another and community, and actually we are created to have relationship with all God's creation, not just God's people, and when that connection, that relationship isn't there, then our mental health and our well-being suffers in the same way as it does if we don't have friendships and family relationships. So this is a quote from the final chapter of the book. During the course of researching this book, I heard many adults describe with eloquence and awe the role of nature in their early spiritual development and how that connection continued to deepen as they aged. So Richard Louv, he is a Christian himself. He's a man of faith. The book is written for a general audience, so that's not something that he refers to until this final chapter, where he talks a little about spiritual connection and the outdoors. And one of the things that he says with great sadness is how the churches don't actually encourage and nurture this sense of eloquence and awe that is natural to children, and allow that to continue within us as we grow older. So we tend to take people in different directions in their spiritual development, and what a shame that is. And wouldn't it be good if we can nurture that and capture it and make that part of children and families' spiritual development, which of course is where Forest Church comes in, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. I've also picked up this from this was a meme that was going around on Facebook when I first put this together, and the idea that the top environmental problems aren't so much biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change, but actually the top environmental problems are selfishness and greed and apathy. And in order to deal with this, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And that's not something that's done by science. That is something done by those who work with spiritual communities, with faith communities. And actually, selfishness and greed and apathy, this is the bread and butter of things that we talk about in our normal church life. So our contribution to the conversation is potentially huge if we can join the dots and bring all of this together. So a little bit of theology, and I'm going to make reference here to Walter Brugermann's work on the Old Testament first, and then a slide on the New Testament to follow. Walter Brugermann is an Old Testament theologian. He does all of the detailed work on the original language and kind of the meaning of small phrases and all of this in the way that the biblical theologians do. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of that, but just say this headline conclusion that he reads, that there is a three-way relationship between God and the people and the land, and that as churches we tend to forget the land bit. We talk a lot about what's on the left-hand side of that triangle, the relationship between people and God, and our individual relationship with God and the community of the church. We might possibly make reference to the right-hand side. The relationship between God and the land it's most obviously there in the nature psalms, in that sense that all creation praises, and all creation has a voice and is singing and raising voices in praise, just as we are. So relationship between God and the land, which is ongoing. Creation wasn't something that God did and then stopped and left it be. There is ongoing relationship there. And then that bottom line, the relationship between the people and the land, then that's what we've just been talking about, the people, the human beings, and our relationship with the natural world around us. I should say that when he's talking about the land, he's really very clear that he's not just talking about the land as in the political boundaries of what we know as Israel. It's the earth, the land and the soil and the earthiness and everything that grows in it, and everything that lives off of the land. So it is kind of really an all creation perspective coming in there. So there's relationships that go in all directions between God and the people and the land, all held in kind of multiple relationships. So in the New Testament, I've actually skipped over the Gospels, and I think what I would want to say about the Gospels is how frequently Jesus refers to the natural world in his teaching and in his parables, and also how frequently he retreats to a quiet space in nature when he's wanting to pray. But I've come here to Colossians. All things in heaven and on earth. In him, all things in heaven and on earth were created. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Through him, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. So, what I want to remind us of, the reason that I picked this, is the sense that all creation is reconciled through the work of the cross. This isn't something just that happened for humanity or for individual human beings, but there is something that was achieved through the work of the cross that reconciles and sets free and sets right all creation, and that's something that we don't talk about enough in churches, and yet it's very clearly here. It's there in Romans as well. It's kind of various places that refer to this fact that it's everything that God has made has been set straight. Although of course we need to work it out, we need to finalize that. But there is a setting right that happened through the work of the cross that is for all creation, not just for humanity. Right. A lot of that has been backstory in many ways. So I'm going to get a bit more practical at this point and talk about what Forest Church is, how to do it, how to get started, what Forest Churches can look like. And probably the first thing to say is that there is as much variety in Forest Churches as there is in a church that gathers indoors. So there is that baseline in common, which is that there is nature connection, there is engagement with the natural world as a part of the gathering and as a core spiritual activity. But beyond that baseline, there is a huge variety. So I tell the story in this Grove booklet of my visits to 5 different Forest Churches, which illustrates the variety in many ways. So in one of them, there was a real focus on children and families. And actually one of the things that we did was at the edge of they're a village surrounded by farmland. So we told the parable of the sower and the seed with a field with seeds growing in it right in front of us. And we looked around us and we could find rocky ground and thorny ground and such like. So it was a kind of a telling of the story with the reality right in front of us there. So that was very much children and families focused. Another one, intergenerational. There were some families, but several adults attending on their own or as couples, and it had been worked out so that there were things for children to do, things to be done, things for everybody to do, things that the adults might want to do that the children wouldn't especially engage with, and they'd kind of worked out something for everybody so that it worked out for everybody concerned. Ancient Arden had a focus on spiritual seekers and the pagan community. That is not for everybody. I think if it's your calling, then do it. If it's not your calling, don't worry about it and get on with doing other things. But it's an important ministry for some people under the Forest Church umbrella, because meeting outdoors is a meeting place with that particular community. West Midlands tends to draw on long forgotten British traditions, So maypole dancing, and the burning of the Christmas tree at Candlemas, and kind of honey cakes and mead, and kind of all of the sort of traditional village things, which are kind of really fun to have a bit of a play with and make that part of our gatherings. Witchwood actually met very close to their church. They have a garden in the Quiet Garden Trust, so we were very close to the church building, using the garden that they have there. Bruce Stanley wasn't one of the churches that I visited, and the reason for that is simply pragmatic, that I went within an hour's drive of home, and Mid Wales is further away. But Bruce tends to have quite a big focus on foraging and cooking in his Forest Church gatherings. So in terms of styles, one group went for a walk, one did prayer stations that were based around the nature in a particular place. So they just looked at what was there and put together some kind of little signposting and prayer stations and things to reflect on. So people could just wander around and find their own space. One did a few activities and then worship at the end. So that's kind of a messy church type of format in many ways. One, as I said, stayed close to the church in a church garden. One went for a short walk and then made a base at the place that they'd walked to, and then walked back again at the end. In terms of formality, again, the range of possibilities is as wide as churches that meet indoors. So formal with service sheets. I've seen Forest churches meeting in a kind of quite as formal and structured way. Informal and completely chaotic, all age intergenerational mishmash. My own Forest church, we do tend to have a service sheet, but it's quite short. So we will open with a little bit of liturgy and kind of call and response, and an introduction to the theme and the season, what's going on around us in the natural world. And then we'll have a core activity, which might be kind of a spot a sheet or go for a walk, or kind of something of that kind. We'll reflect on, we'll stop at some point, we'll reflect on what we've seen, what we've experienced, and then there'll be some kind of formal prayers at the end to kind of, so that we're kind of topped and tailed with a little bit of formality, but with some chaos in the middle, some chaos and some nature connection in the middle. And our prayers, we have some prayers that we use very regularly at the end that remind us to live gently by the natural world, by God's creation in whatever we do next. Kind of a reminder that Forest Church isn't a thing that we do and then leave behind, but we hope to take that learning and that attitude with us into our daily lives and the choices that we are making. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I prepare, and then talk us through some autumn themes, just to illustrate and give some example of where I tend to go and how it tends to work itself out. So I tend to go for a walk in the space that we're going to use, where we're going to gather, and find out what's happening there and what's growing, or have the leaves turned yet. So to just go and find out what nature is doing, what we might find when we go there kind of a week or so later. And I will go there kind of prayerfully, kind of seeking a theme and something to work with that connects with what I'm finding, connects what I'm finding and experiencing in nature with the Christian tradition. And then I'll come back and I will find an activity that fits the theme and find some prayers and a reading that will kind of begin and end. So that's kind of my basic pattern when I'm preparing. So I'm going to run through a few themes that tend to come up. This Hebrews 11:1, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. In the autumn, particularly later autumn, when the trees have lost their leaves, everything looks dead. It looks like there is no hope, no life. You know, everything has pulled back, and there's a really powerful connection between the seasons and the cycle of the year, and the heart of our Christian faith as we remember death and resurrection, as we remember Easter hope. So we come into late autumn and into the winter with a sure and certain hope that there will be new growth next spring, that although it all looks dead, we are expecting there to be new life to come. And so it's a really powerful theme to work with, as we might be feeling hopeless about some things. We might be struggling to find hope personally, or for society, or for the planet. And so we connect the hope that is there in nature, knowing that spring will come, with the hope that is there in the Christian story, and allow that to renew us and refresh us. It's one of the reasons I really encourage groups to keep going in the winter, because if your Forest Church only meets in the springtime and the summer and the lovely weather, then you miss this depth, and that's a real shame and a real loss. Falling leaves, letting go. What do we need to let go of? We might play catch a falling leaf at this point, if we're with families and children. Evergreen and deciduous, that play different roles in the natural world. Are we drawing back right now, personally speaking, or do we have some energy to be in leaf, and to be bearing fruit, you know, the winter fruit and winter food for others around us? It's a season of rest and recovery. Can we, or do we need to be the evergreens that are still bearing fruit in the winter? A season of waiting and trusting. Harvest themes. I really like considering harvest for the whole of nature, and remembering that God's provision isn't just for us as we eat and celebrate and harvest with Thanksgiving, but actually harvest is there for all creation. So I quite enjoy this time of year, and for the next couple of months, having a look at all of the berries that we won't eat, but others of God's creatures will eat. And I've put up there Matthew 6. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And so that you know, you can work with that theme very easily with a group where we're exploring harvest for us, and all that God gives us, harvest for nature, and giving thanks for all of the above. I talked about using resources from Wildlife Watch. This is one example. So winter nuts and berries, spotter sheet, and we use spotter sheets fairly frequently. They're a really useful tool to get us looking and noticing and appreciating, and learning. I think one of my all-time favourites is actually not the one that I've put up here, but the identification of leaf buds of trees from the leaf buds in winter. So I think many of us know leaves, can identify a tree from leaf, or can identify at least some trees from leaves. It's much more challenging in the winter when we've just got the leaf buds to go on, and it's actually a good way of adults and children learning together, because it's often something that adults don't know very well either. So it brings a real level playing field to an activity. And actually, whilst I'm talking about children, children are often really good at nature connection, and we kind of train them out of it. So if you go at the pace of children, you will stop every 5 paces to look at an interesting thing that they've found, a spider's web or fungi or a leaf with holes in it, all kinds of stuff like that. Anybody who's done a school run with a 5-year-old will know the challenge, where the child is trying to stop all the time to look at all these interesting things, and we're looking at our watch and trying to hurry them along. Forest Church is actually going at the child's pace, and stopping and looking and noticing and not looking at the watch, and allowing the children to actually show us how to do this thing. So that's spotter sheets, and a sidetrack. Bulb planting. Bulb planting is really nice to illustrate how we work together with God, where you know, a bulb's not going to grow just because we planted it. A bulb only grows because of, you know, the hand of God in working in and through natural processes. So we can't do anything to make that happen, but we can put the bulb in the ground. So it's a really nice illustration of how God works and we work, and there's a partnership, and we do things together, which, in terms of the big environmental conversations around us, a great reminder that that God is at work, and we hope in God, and that hopefully helps us a little with our eco-anxiety, that we can hope that God is at work, but we need to do some stuff too. We need to do some bulb planting, and some bigger stuff, like changing our car, or changing the heating system in our church, or whatever it happens to be. We work together, we work in partnership with God. Dying back and regrowth, death and resurrection. I talked about this in a sense a little bit earlier. I love this image because we've got last year's leaf died back and dead on the twig there, but also the next season's leaf buds already there, and they will overwinter. You know, that the buds of next year's leaves will sit there on the twig, on the branch, all winter, ready for the right moment to come forward into new life. And a Christmas one. It's a great time for sunset adventures with small children, because sunset will happen at something stupid like 3:30 in the afternoon, when we're getting really close to midwinter, or 4 o'clock or 4:30, depending on quite when we go. But we've taken our Forest Church up our hill. We meet on a hill on the outskirts of Gloucester City, and we've watched the sunset from the top, and we've come back down with our torches or our phone torches, and all of the reflections that are at the heart of Christmas celebrations about the light shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And I've got words from Psalm 139 up there as well. So all of those kind of Christmas themes of light in darkness, then we again see lived out in the natural world around us. Although a health warning that you sometimes go up the hill to see the sunset, and you find that you've got mist and fog and poor weather, and you have a different kind of an adventure. So you whenever we're working with nature, we need to take what is sent us. It doesn't always work quite to plan. So this is my final slide, and then we can go into some Q&A. This is from one of my interviews with Forest Church facilitators. She says, if nature is where I find a deep connection with God, then I should nurture that connection, not just by going for a walk, but actually by going for a walk and really stopping and trying to notice my connection with God, or by praying or doing a ritual or something in this place that seems so. And then she goes on and she talks about how if she has that intention, as when gathering as a forest church, where you stop and you intentionally notice your connection and make it prayerful, then sometimes you then go out for a walk without particularly intending to worship. You're just going for a walk, and then you find yourself, the prayer comes without particularly planning it. You go out in the countryside and I find myself worshiping God. So to plug into that, to do it intentionally, seems to me quite powerful. I'm going to end there and we'll go into some Q&A.
Thank you, Kate. That was really great and really inspiring. We have a few questions, but I'm going to cheat because I can and go first and ask a question. One of the things I was thinking less about the word forest and more about the word church. And one of the key things that makes us a church is our connection and how we form community. So can you tell us how Forest Church is it a good place for forming community? Do people just come and then go and they never speak apart from the next time they come, or how does that work?
Okay, there's a range of expressions of Forest Church in terms of how close they are to a parish church. There's quite a lot of Forest churches where it's in the sense that a church has its Sunday services and also has a messy church and also has a Forest church. So there's quite a lot of parishes that are doing that kind of thing. There's others which are set further away, and they're much more independent as a fresh expression. In terms of building community, I think my experience of Forest Church is that we notice things together, and we have conversations around this interesting mushroom that we found, or a bracket fungus, or a butterfly, or whatever it happens to be. And that's a starting place for a conversation, and you can meet people and get to know people with that as kind of your small talk and your starting place, and then deeper conversations come from there as we walk together, as we talk about how difficult it is to ditch single-use plastic, because everything in the supermarkets is covered in the stuff. And conversations kind of come up, usually with something of an eco focus, but also general life and all of life as well. So I would say, yeah, relationship building is actually quite easy when you go for a walk together.
That's really good to hear. Thank you. Right, so we've got I think we've got enough questions to sufficient time, I should say, to get through all these questions. So I'm just going to go for it. The first one is, why do you think the traditional church is so obsessed with its buildings rather than with nature?
Oh goodness. I mean, we have to be honest about the weather. In Britain, we're quite a rainy little island, or little set of islands. So I can see the attraction of meeting indoors from that sense. I think we end up feeling that we're custodians of these ancient buildings, which, and I kind of, I'm really torn on that. I think it is a distraction from so many things, and yet there are also these beautiful ancient buildings that I don't want to just neglect and leave to fall down. So I think we find ourselves caught in a bit of a trap, really, where we feel we need to look after these ancient buildings, and they take so much of our energy. I'm not quite answering the question, really. I'm just kind of talking around the question, but I don't think there's an easy answer to this one, really.
No, I think you're probably right. I think for some people, this is a phrase I like, churches are a thin space.
Yeah.
And for them, the actual building and whatever's in the building is their place for encounter. And for others, nature is their thin space, isn't it? Yeah. And I'm going to skip down to the bottom if anybody's actually looking at the questions. Another thought, any more thoughts about the weather dimension, somebody says. Do we just put our coats and hats on?
We put our coats and hats on. We also might adapt our meeting place so that we're a bit more under tree cover rather than a bit more out in the open. Same as you might if you're going for a kind of slightly drizzly day walk. So we've I don't think we've ever completely cancelled because it's been that awful. We've you know, for all that we're a rainy nation, the rain often looks worse from indoors than it is when you go out in it. So yeah, there are days when there are complete downpours, but rain's often just a bit drizzly and light rain, and so we'll just adapt what we're doing a little bit. We have had times where our service sheet has got a bit soggy and we can barely read it by the end of the time, but we've usually quite enjoyed ourselves, so it's okay. So some forest churches set up a kind of a tarp covering or something like that, so that they do have a dry space. So it perhaps depends who you're working with and how used they are to getting into their rainy day clothes and just going for it.
Yeah. So the follow-up to that question was, how does the congregation respond? And I guess it depends who's in the congregation.
How does the congregation respond?
The weather, the rain, yeah.
Yeah, and I think congregations respond in the same way as they do to messy churches and to kind of other forms of fresh expression, and you sometimes get the comments about, you know, when are we going to see them on a Sunday morning, and not really understanding that a fresh expression can be church in itself. But there are others that really celebrate it as kind of part of the thriving of the church, just a different kind of thriving. So you're going to get a huge mixture of responses. There's not any one thing, I think.
Okay, and you've mentioned Muddy Church a couple of times. Do you have any experience of running Muddy Church? Do we need to say what we think it is?
I think there's a whole load of terms out there that are really in the same ballpark, and a lot of us use the term forest church for something which is very similar to Muddy Church. My own forest church is intergenerational. We have children and families, so I'm not sure that I could really identify what is different from Muddy Church. I think Muddy Church is particularly children and family focused. Messy Church are also working on a pilot at the moment on something that they're calling Messy Church Goes Wild, so it's perhaps worth drawing attention to that as well. But again, a lot of these things are all in the same ballpark. You know, I've come across a welly church, and outdoors church and wild church, and I think we're all working in the same space, really, just using slightly different terminology for it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Someone's asking about a resource for younger children called Planet Protectors by Paul Carenza, Ruth Valerio. Do you know anything about it? I
don't know that one. No, I tend to promote Rachel Summers' resources, kind of wild worship.
Wild worship, yeah.
Wild Lent, wild Advent, for particularly for child-focused stuff. That's not one I know, but it sounds worth exploring. Perhaps I need to get myself a copy and have a read.
Great. And while we're on resources, thinking about your Grove booklet and the original, what's his name? Stanley.
Bruce Stanley. Yeah.
What's the difference between the two?
Part of it is we're just different people. Part of it is, Bruce was writing when this was quite a new conversation, so nobody was doing it. There was some very early explorations, so he was drawing on people like Richard Louv, who I mentioned, and wondering what that might mean for churches and how we might take that forward. By the time I wrote my Grove booklet, there were lots of forest churches out there, so I was able to then go and experience some different types and interview some people and do some theological reflection on that. So they're quite different, but complementary. The other resources that people need, I guess, to get started are outdoor focused prayers, so that there's a fair few books around that do that quite well. Gosh, I'm trying to think. I'm looking at my bookshelf. So David Cole has produced some good resources. Stephen Shakespeare, Tess Ward, Annie Heppenstall, and these are all liturgical resources for those that find that helpful to be part of what they're using. And Rachel Summers stuff, and a whole load of spotter sheets and the wildlife charities for nature focused activities.
Okay, that's great, thanks. And there's some people are commenting in the chat, so if anybody's not spotted that, there's some more links in there as well. We're going to veer into a bit of theology now. You were talking about, it was this question came when you were talking about that passage from Colossians. So the comment is, from Genesis we see that all creation is fallen, so how is Christ's sacrifice redeeming for this when we think of nature red in tooth and claw?
Goodness.
You've got 2 seconds. No.
I've got 2 seconds. Okay. I'm going to go to Romans 8, which is the other one that I didn't use. And there's a sense in Romans 8 of all creation kind of groaning in labor pains until humanity gets its act together and stands up and acts right. So that there's a sense in the need for as we are redeemed, as we live right by God, by one another, by God's creation. So too the rest of creation is allowed to be redeemed and to live in right balance. And there is so much out there which is destructive and difficult in the natural world, as well as the glorious sunsets and the mountains, and the earthquakes and volcanoes and all of that. And I think we just need to live right and trust God to bring all to a proper fulfillment in the way that God knows is right, and in the way that we probably can't tie down at this point because we don't see clearly enough. Yeah,
I think that's a good answer, especially that idea that we can't tie it down. If we could, we'd have done it, wouldn't we?
yeah.
Okay, and then slightly different but still on that sort of a deeper background thinking. You talked about some things like maypole dancing that might be traditionally regarded as pagan in origin, and I know that some of these groups you talked about working with that group and seekers, as you call them. But the question is, it can be hard to portray environmental activities as Christian to traditionalists. So, if we're going to do maypole dancing, is that a step too far? How do we overcome this? And it might be about audience, mightn't it?
I think a lot of it is about audience, and I think we need to remind ourselves that the word pagan just means country dweller. So we've tended to give it a kind of a religious overtone, but there's a whole history to contemporary paganism, which is, I won't go into right now, but that word pagan is just country people kind of celebrating the natural world in and amongst their daily lives, which were very close to the natural world and very dependent on the natural world. So celebration of fertility in spring was about there being food quite apart from anything else. So I'm not inclined to be afraid of that at a spiritual level, but some people are, and actually probably just don't go there. If you know that your people are going to be getting twitchy about it, just focus on nature and growth and biblical texts that connect with what you're seeing in the natural world, and take it in that direction, rather than know your audience and know what works for the people that you're working with.
Okay, good. The next question: it seems very important that the soil itself is a source of seasonal regeneration to enable plants to recover in spring, often neglected. That's more of a comment, but you might have something to say about soil.
Yeah, I know the Messy Church Goes Wild project has got a session called Soil, so they're explicitly going there. But yeah, I can only agree really that we neglect soil, we neglect soil's role in carbon capture, we neglect soil's the importance of fertility and a whole load of stuff around farming practices. So yeah, we could have a long conversation about soil, but absolutely we need to not neglect that part of the conversation.
Good, thank you. Now this next one is a very practical question. What sort of insurance is required for Forest Church activities?
Okay, it depends on your setup. If you're doing it as a parish church, in a similar way to a Messy Church, it is likely going to be covered under your church's insurance. My own Messy Church, we meet on a kind of a country park, council-owned green space, and what we did was have a conversation with the warden, and actually we nicked a lot of their risk assessment stuff and adapted that for what we were going to use. So we found out that basically any group meeting on that particular space is covered by their insurance. So we didn't insure ourselves separately because we were covered by their insurance. So that's what we did. So I think any group that isn't closely allied to a church, it's a bit more complicated, and you would need to have a conversation with the space where you're meeting, and you might need to take out some insurance if the space isn't one. You know, a council country park is straightforward. An open space, you might need to sort that yourselves. Yeah, so there's no one answer. It depends on your setup, I think.
Okay, and this will have to be the last one, I think. Do you meet weekly, or what do you meet? And in which case, how do you address the wide range of themes that are integral to the church year, not just creation and sustainability?
Okay, my own doesn't meet weekly. We actually meet 6 weekly on the pattern of nature's seasons and cycles. So midsummer, midwinter, the equinoxes, and the midpoints between that. So that comes out as 6 weekly, eight times a year. A lot meet monthly, and I don't know of any that meet weekly, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. I think monthly is quite popular in the same way as Messy Church. I think at one level, the theme of interconnection with the natural world is as woven through everything as you know, and any theme about interpersonal relationships, which comes up at all times and in all places. I think I'm now quoting liturgy by accident, but I don't want to say that you talk about environment on one occasion and you talk about something else on another occasion. I think I would prefer to weave it through together so that there's an environmental dimension and a human dimension and another theme that kind of all comes together, depending on what's going on in the church's calendar and in the natural world. So yeah, I think that's probably the heart of my answer, that I don't want to separate out and keep it as a whole as we go through each year.
Yeah, thank you. That has been really, really interesting. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining in and for sharing those questions. We had a really interesting range of really practical ones and a few really deep ones, so that I think really helps. Cate, it's been really nice listening to you and hearing from you, and I want to go outside and put my hands in the earth now.
You do that, enjoy.
Yeah, so the recording will be made available. I will save the chat because there's a few links that people have joined to. I've not really put anything in there, and that will probably come out to you as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jo. Thanks for joining me.